Hello and welcome to the podcast taking you beyond the scores and hopefully giving you a wider view of the week in sports news. I'm Rob Harris and this is Sport Unlocked. The big story we're discussing this week. English football leaders have been demanding tougher action from Twitter and Facebook to stop players being racially abused. We'll discuss that with one of world football's top anti-discrimination executives, Piara Powar of the Fair Network. We'll also hear about his organisation's work on gender inequality as the president of the Tokyo Olympics resigns after making sexist comments. Well, alongside me again, it's great to have Martyn, Ziegler and Tariq Panja, and welcome in particular to the growing numbers of listeners from around the world. Now guys, you've been going through some of the data. Which locations have particularly stood out from the analytics about where people are tuning in from?
We seem to have listeners all over the world. Colorado, Saudi Arabia, and Tariq, you've been investigating our Central Asian listeners.
Yeah, I just want to say a big hello to our one listener in Kyrgyzstan. Hope you're enjoying our show.
Oh, you're all very welcome, and send any of your feedback in, either on Twitter @SportUnlocked or on email sportunlockpod@gmail.com. So before we get into the main headline talking points, what else has caught your eye this week in the headlines?
Well, we've had there's a big meeting of all UEFA's 55 associations to discuss the ongoing Champions League reforms. UEFA, I think, were pretty pleased with the reaction. They said it was either reassuringly harmonious or harmoniously reassuring. I think there's certainly no big attacks on them. However, the Premier League clubs, the smaller clubs, I think they've been holding talks on how they can oppose this officially, because they do not like the idea of Manchester United finishing sixth, for example, and getting in the Champions League, while somebody like Leicester City would finish fifth and not do so.
And one of the concerns I'm hearing about is the potential impact on the value of domestic television rights, which has a knock-on effect for clubs, because there'll be so many more fixtures in Europe with the new Champions League format that it could put the squeeze on the amount of cash available for broadcasters to pay for domestic rights too. Now, Tariq, anything particularly caught your eye from the actual sport that's been taking place over the last week?
Yeah, for me, the moment of the week was England's fantastic victory in the first test against India. Joe Root's batting, and in particular, there's super over a reverse swing from Jimmy Anderson on the last day that pretty much secured victory. And it was all broadcast free to air for the first time in a very long time on Channel 4. And the numbers have been fantastic. They averaged 500,000 throughout the entire 5 days. Day 3, 1.7 million. And a lot of these viewers are young kids who probably have never had the chance to watch cricket because it's been on pay TV for so long. So hopefully some new fans for the sport. Really excited about all that, and roll on the second test.
It's been great to have some live cricket to watch for these cold English winter mornings, and we've also had some tennis from the Australian Open too through the week, but the venue's going to look empty again because fans have been locked out as of Friday night due to the new lockdown that's been imposed in Melbourne. It's only 5 days, but it was caused by barely a dozen coronavirus cases detected in the city. It just shows how seriously they're taking things over this pandemic in Australia. Now, back in England, one of the troubling moments for me this week was when we discovered the death threats that had been aimed at the referee Mike Dean. Really deeply disturbing, and it's something the police are now looking into. Down in the lower leagues, we also got a big decision from an arbitration panel which backed the Professional Footballers Association and blocked the EFL from introducing salary caps of £2.5 million in League One and £1.25 million in League Two. Obviously, there's still big concerns about the financial situation at those clubs as the stadiums remain completely closed to fans. Now, Ziegs, social media is a big talking point on this pod. Are you on TikTok?
Yeah, I'm toying with the idea. My obviously my sons are on it, it's the way to go. But yeah, there's been some news on that, hasn't there, Rob?
I do indeed, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of TikTok in football because they've signed up as a sponsor of Euro 2020. It means that 4 of UEFA's main tournament sponsors are now Chinese firms. So alongside TikTok are Alipay, Hisense, and Vivo.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there was all sorts of things about it. Was it connected with the Chinese state somehow using it to get access to secret material from the West. But I mean, it looks like UEFA's embracing it, even if Donald Trump wasn't. But what is TikTok to people who don't know what it is, Rob?
Well, it's quite similar to Instagram, and there are short videos, but there's a lot more dancing and there's lip syncing. None of which you'll find on the videos on my feed at Rob Harris Reports, which is mostly football stadiums. Tariq, you're nowhere near TikTok, but it's a pretty interesting deal that they've signed with UEFA.
It's interesting, the investment from TikTok, because we've seen mixed messages from Chinese investors in sports in recent times. There's suggestions that Inter Milan, which is owned by one of China's richest men, the chap who owns the behemoth Suning company, apparently that club is up for sale. Talk of the Southampton owners looking to sell up as well. And it feels a different time from 2017 and 2016 when all that Chinese money came flooding into European football and sports in general. So yeah, it's mixed. Quite surprised that TikTok have invested now, maybe against that backdrop, but also they're just so popular. I mean, even you're on it, Rob.
I've got to keep an eye on these modern things, although I probably found a lot less content there for me than perhaps some of the harder sports news on some other social networks and the type of thing we discuss here.
TikTok's sponsorship of the Euros shows the Chinese still very keen on football, and I mean they were supposed to be hosting the new Club World Cup this year, weren't they? But now it's we've had the old smaller version in Qatar, and really it's barely caused a ripple, I think, is it? I mean I know there's no English clubs involved, and Bayern Munich won it fairly comfortably. But it seems to me it's sort of you can see why FIFA is so desperate for it to be a big summer tournament, because it's hardly created any interest at all.
The only unpredictable part of it was the fact that for the first time, North American team reached the final with Tigres from Mexico, and predictably though Bayern won 1-0, so the Europeans take the trophy again. Doesn't mean Bayern have won all 7 trophies over the last year, but it seemed that there was perhaps as much attention in Germany on Bayern's links with Qatar than on the actual sporting performance as well.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, Rob. There was a big backlash about Bayern being there, their sponsorship links with Qatar, and also how they've tried to water down all the human rights concerns. So, as an example of what some people allege to be sports washing, it was kind of classic. You get your brand into a big institution like Bayern Munich and use them to be your spokespeople. And Bayern have tried to be effective in doing that for Qatar. But the backlash has been quite loud, particularly in Germany.
Yeah, of course, Bayern Munich are sponsored by Qatar Airways, and there's been all sorts of fan protests over the last couple of years over those links with Qatar. And actually, one of the other big issues to come out of the Club World Cup was the fact Thomas Muller tested positive for coronavirus, and it was announced just hours before kickoff, which showed that even if you've been tested beforehand, before flying on arrival, that the risks are there. And unlike anyone else perhaps going into Qatar, there was no need to quarantine for the Bayern team, and yet they still potentially brought infection and risk spreading it there, which raises all sorts of questions of what was the point of staging this international tournament as the pandemic persists and there are new variants and concerns over those.
Yeah, speaking of COVID, we've had all this disruption because of the to the Champions League, because of the various travel embargoes on countries, particularly travellers from Britain. So it means that games featuring English clubs are being played all over Europe instead of where they were supposed to be. For example, Liverpool's game against Leipzig has been moved to Hungary. I think Manchester City's game against Mönchengladbach is going to be played in Romania. There's a Europa League game from Manchester United, which were relegated from the Champions League. It's been played in Italy. Arsenal are also, I think, playing in Italy.
And Arsenal's home leg against Benfica is actually going to be in Athens. It's a real logistical headache, this, for UEFA, as they do persist with these two-legged games across the continent, despite all the coronavirus travel restrictions. Well, on to our main discussion point of the week now, and it's the ongoing racist abuse that footballers are facing on social media. We did hear from Facebook, the owner of Instagram, this week that they would take stronger action. They said they would disable accounts that send racist abuse on direct messages, but I later discovered after pressing the company that only an unspecified number of repeated abusive messages would lead to a ban. And that's perhaps why we've seen a letter from all the leaders across English football to the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and his Facebook counterpart, Mark Zuckerberg, asking them to show, as they put it, basic human decency by taking stronger action against the racist abusers. They write in this letter that they've had many meetings over the years with executives from Twitter and Facebook, but as they put it, the reality is your platforms remain havens for abuse. The letter goes on. Your inaction has created the belief in the minds of the anonymous perpetrators that they are beyond reach. Now, this letter was signed by the FA, the Premier League, the Women's Super League representative, the Managers and Players Union, and also Kick It Out. So it's a real united effort and a push to finally try to secure some stronger action from these social networks, because certainly what we discovered is there is not zero tolerance from Facebook and Instagram, at least. The fact that one racist message is not enough to get a user booted off the platform. Well, to discuss all this in a lot more depth, I'm delighted to welcome to Sport Unlocked the Executive Director of the Fair Network, Piara Powar. Welcome, Piara.
Hey guys, good to see you guys. I think last time we met was about a year ago exactly.
In Amsterdam, was that at the UEFA draw? And
it was in Amsterdam. No, but generally, I think what you guys have started here is really very interesting because I'm a bit fed up with all the groin strain tactical type podcasts. It's good to have some real authoritative news about what's going on in things that I'm interested in. News about football and sport politics, media rights, just the stuff that doesn't really get covered very well so often.
So for those who don't know, Fair, one of your key things is obviously investigating incidents across Europe of racism and discrimination across games.
Yeah, so I would say that you would put our work into two boxes, if you have to box us up. One is that we look at discrimination inside football, and most of that actually is inside stadiums. And then we use football as a tool. So we're slightly different, I think, from other organizations that people might know, Kick It Out and others. We have a kind of social development focus as well. So we have projects running in Latin America, Africa, Asia, North America, across Europe. Europe is our kind of foundation, if you like. It's our starting point, but we kind of have managed the relationship with FIFA and other funders to get a bit further afield.
Piara, what do you think about what Facebook's and Instagram's response this week? I mean, I'm slightly amazed that they are saying that people can send racist direct messages, and that's not an automatic reason for shutting their accounts down effectively because they think they should be given an opportunity to learn from their mistakes.
Yeah, I think, Martyn, this whole area actually is quite fascinating because you have the collision of tech and relatively new companies who are also now huge companies. Facebook is now the fifth or sixth biggest company in the world and growing fast. Twitter is growing very, very fast. A collision of new types of communications that we all enjoy. Great source of information, great way of people to connect with each other across borders, through walls, so to speak. But at the same time, we're now seeing the regulatory challenges that people face, and we're seeing that through football and racist and sexist abuse. And it seems actually that because of the location of the platforms as companies and the dispensations offered to them by the American government in terms of regulation, and actually their ideological pitching, which is all about the freedom of speech, the freedom to connect, the freedom of self-expression. They frame their services within those sort of contexts. And so there's a big challenge ahead. And I've been surprised, I think like a lot of people, that the furore that's been seen universally in English football, but also in other places, their failure to take down and challenge, the worst type of sort of racism and sexism we see, has really left them untouched. They just don't seem to see it as a priority, because there's no question that they have the technical capability to deal with it. There's no question that they could put people on it. They have the resources to do that. And so it's very frustrating, but also half interesting to see, what this new era of disruptive tech looks like. And it's not pretty, right? It's not very good. Instagram's big announcement this week, if you scratch beneath the surface, it's quite clear. They are saying they will take down closed accounts that are repeatedly abusive. They're not saying that any abusive post, any racist, sexist, homophobic post will mean that user is banned. And that isn't really a position that's acceptable to many people.
Yeah, Piara, just to be clear as well, that's Facebook as well. So you got WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook all under that one umbrella. That is a lot of power for that one company. And you mentioned there that they're based in the States and in terms of regulation, etc. But they're doing business in Europe. They're doing business in the UK. There isn't a reason why the UK government or the European Union couldn't take action. It just almost feels like these companies are too big for them to tackle, and they don't want to sometimes get into those fights. The EU, I think, to be fair to its credit, in some areas has taken on big tech like GDPR issues, etc. So they probably can. So we might be reaching a tipping point here if these big names, clubs, FAs, players, etc., start speaking up as they are now. If this carries on, maybe it will get too loud for them to do nothing and sit on their hands.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point rapidly. The online harms bill here in the UK, I think, is a very interesting development, and really the government needs to speed that up. The EU are looking at this and have some legislation that has been drafted and I would say is ready to go fairly soon, in the next 6 months, we understand. The model is Germany, as in so many things, right? They introduced a bill in 2017, which focuses on the platforms having to take down abuse once they've been notified about it. And of course, the sanctions are financial. The German government has already been levying quite heavy fines on both Twitter and on Facebook. So that regulation is coming in. I think we're very clear, as most people are, that this is an area where that sort of regulation is going to be the way to change things. And we are at that tipping point. You're absolutely right. I think the problem is, of course, that don't underestimate Facebook's, in particular, Twitter are a younger company, but Facebook's ability to lobby governments to make the case for the revenue that they can bring, the way in which they have changed the advertising model, turned it upside down, and the income and the number of people that they employ in the States. So I think that it's not as easy as it sounds, but definitely state regulation is on the cards. And then the other thing I think is that there's it's quite interesting to see this letter that was sent. I would say, look, it's largely symbolic, isn't it? Sending a letter to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg. The same letter is symbolic, but it's a signal of intent by the English football authorities. And I would argue that what they probably need to do now is to have their own boycott. Like, can you imagine if Premier League clubs, even symbolically for one day this year, called for a boycott of social media use by their fans, didn't post anything for a day, and then kept doing that until the platforms showed some serious intent? Because there's no question, although the issues in football are a pinprick probably on a scratch on the back of what Facebook is facing globally. If the level of engagements that football brings, the hundreds of millions of engagements, they just wouldn't want to lose that. And then if everybody comes together and say, okay, we're serious and we're going to show you how serious we are by removing ourselves from your platforms, we can do it. That, I think, would be quite incredible.
We had FIFA this week also expressing their concern about the abuse of players on social media. But then it made me reflect that actually a lot of the coverage we're seeing is from England, and surely it can't just be English players who are the ones being targeted.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And also, obviously, football's not the only big professional sport in the world. When you look at North America, NFL and NBA, it's got a big cohort of black athletes. Piara, do you know if we see that type of abuse, the type of abuse we're seeing here, which is increasingly sickening and increasingly targeted? Do we see that in US sports? Do you know?
Well, generally, Tariq, if you look at the types of racism we see in Europe and in actually other continents, in Latin America, for example, around football, US sport doesn't suffer so much from that. They suffer from black athletes being stereotyped, of course, the stacking that we've seen historically in the NFL. They suffer from isolated forms of abuse inside stadiums. So generally, the picture is that the athletes say, "No, we don't really get that. You guys are brave going out there in an English or a French or Polish football stadium and facing that." If we really look at this, the free flowing nature of football, then also, and the mistakes that are made, and you come back from a mistake, or the mistake leads to something difficult. That also, the way in which football is played also lends to people suddenly picking up their phone and making a comment on Twitter. Right. Whereas the stop-start nature of the NFL and the NBA, actually, with all the timeouts, doesn't lend itself to that so much. That's not to say there is no abuse. I think there is, but it's certainly not as bad as it is here. And you certainly wouldn't see the sort of language being used that you do here. And the other side to this, of course, is, and this is a very important point, one I think the social media companies will bring up again, and that law enforcement will face here in the UK, is that much of that abuse may also be coming from abroad. Right? If you look at some of the cases where people's IPs have been traced, there are people in Singapore, there are people in Latin America who are abusive. We've got some interesting research coming out in the next couple of months around some monitoring we did around the Champions League and Europa League final matches in August. And, there you have audiences that are truly international. So some 14-year-old kid sitting in Singapore can racially abuse someone who's playing, an English black player who's playing in the Champions League. So, and in the US, the NBA is big, of course, but because of the time zones, because of the way that sport is regarded, there's less of that. And this is the problem. And this is also why I think the piece that's missing from our debate here is the need for the social media platforms to bring about culture change, the need for them to do more to address their users and to lay down the regulations culturally, to say, this is a platform we offer to you to connect with people, to have some fun on, but the boundaries are very clear as well. You just don't see that. I'm on Twitter every day. I never see anything from Jack Dorsey or any type of flagging from Twitter that you see. The first time we saw that actually was when, Donald Trump's tweets were being flagged as possibly being inaccurate. So you need to see more of that also, I think, so people can have the cultural tone set for them.
Well, someone certainly setting a bad tone this week has been Yoshihiro Mori. He's the former Japanese Prime Minister and now former President of the 2020 Tokyo Games. He caused outrage by claiming that women talk too much and make meetings drag on. He's finally bowed to pressure and he's quit as head of the organising committee for the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics. Well, before he did step down, I discussed the controversy with Hege Riise. She's the interim head coach of the England women's team, and she could be heading the Team GB football side in Tokyo.
That's no comment for a man in that position and we should not accept that. So I guess he kind of regret that. I hope so, because we don't want that kind of comments.
I mean, I was interested that the IOC took 5 days to respond and then put out a really, really strong statement criticising him, which normally they protect their own. I just wondered if people thought that the IOC actually wanted to see him resign because it helped their ideas generally about putting on the games.
I think it's a bit sad if that's the case. That the IOC really only acts, puts pressure on him to resign, given what he said, which was deeply sexist, because it helps them in the planning of the Olympics or whatever action they want to take in terms of reorganizing, slimming it down. That is sound, but that is what happens. People are opportunistic around diversity issues. We don't want them to be, but that's what happens. In the end, the story is that he's left because of the sexist comments he made, and I think that's good enough. What's going on behind the scenes is going to be going on behind the scenes.
A degree of kind of tone deafness from the Japanese side over who was going to replace the 83-year-old Mr. Mori. They had a plan for an 84-year-old man to replace him, and as of recording, they haven't decided. But there's been a backlash against that as well. You would have thought they'd see that coming. Now there's talk of replacing him with a woman, a capable woman who could take that role. But you got to wonder why they didn't think of that in the first place. It's kind of these obvious mistakes, these obvious punches in your own face, and then you get to a point where you do the right thing. But it just shows how far we've got to go, where the people behind the scenes who are doing the thinking still can't get it quite right. And on that point as well, with the IOC, they put out this statement telling us about the level of diversity they have. All these organizations trumpet their diversity these days, particularly when it comes to gender. But then you look at the post a lot of these female officials have, and often they're not the decision makers. They have maybe a fancy title. So if you look at the IOC, you've got Thomas Bach there, you've got a male head of comms, you've got a head of the Olympics marketing is a guy, chief of staff is a man. So it is a very kind of male, usually kind of European, North American male figure and figures who lead these organizations. You can almost use the example of FIFA there as well. The second in command, or in fact the most senior administrator at FIFA, is an African woman in Fatma Samura. But when it comes to taking decisions or plotting the direction of football in the world, unfortunately, she's nowhere to be seen. She's almost like pushed to the side, dealing seems to be solely with development issues, and particularly those concerning Africa, which is very different to the person she replaced in Jerome Valk. He was front and center designing the World Cup, dealing with sponsors, doing all this stuff. Fatma, during this global pandemic, has hardly been seen. Again, it's not about just plopping a woman in place or a minority in place, but giving them power, allowing them to influence the direction of the organization. And I think until we see that, we haven't really got much in terms to show for ourselves. What would you say, Piara?
Yeah, talking in general terms, I think you're right. In diversity practice, it's been well recorded actually that organizations that take on women often do so in the second tier managerial level. The top leadership level, they're often not given a look in, and often they are found in the kind of service areas, HR, sometimes in communications. But you're right, when it comes to the real decision making areas, the political lead, the chiefs of staff, the commercial deals, then they're squeezed out. I think that actually is a phenomenon across the corporate world, but it's particularly acute in sport. And one of the things actually that strikes me about specifically about gender equality is that a lot of people say it's a priority for them. We have been obviously following what's been happening in football globally. Every leader in football says we need to have more women on board. The exco's need to diversify. We need to get more women leading different divisions. But we're just coming to a point where we're publishing some data soon, which follows on from some 2015 data, and actually the numbers haven't changed really. There's a percentage difference of 1 or 2% to 2015. So in 5 years, going on 6 years, the figures haven't changed despite the rhetoric that we keep hearing from leaders. And people say, well, we're stuck because of the system that we have, because of the way in which certain political leaders are nominated onto excos, and we can't really get around that. But actually, there are lots of creative solutions. You mentioned a very interesting word, which I think a lot of players talk about, a lot of black players talk about, actually, which is the lack of power they have in the game. Despite their achievements, despite the qualifications that they might go and do, they feel disempowered. They're not acknowledged as potential leaders. And when they are given jobs, they're given jobs on the sidelines, in the margins. And sometimes, when you talk to corporate people about power, they're not really interested. But if you relate it to responsibility and decision making, then they can see the point and relate it a bit better. So I think that this is something, the need for culture change in sport is urgent. The need for culture change in football is urgent, because that's one of the things that struck me, for example, this week when I saw the Premier League issue their new action plan. I think understanding your organisation, looking at the data of who you employ, who you're working with, is very, very important. Who's in leadership positions. And then the next step is to set targets. But the thing that a lot of organisations then miss out is the culture change, is the way that you see those people that come in, the way in which you give them responsibility and power, the way in which you then nurture them and mentor them and help them with their needs to become good leaders and therefore fulfil a positive prophecy rather than one of failure. So there's football in particular, which is my particular domain, has a lot of work to do in this area. It's almost incredible. And then if you look at international football and the lack of racially diverse leadership, it's absolutely appalling, particularly given the fact that players of African heritage, whether they're from Latin America, Africa, or the Caribbean, or indeed, are second or third generation migrants to Europe, has been incredible. The impact that they've made. Some of the greatest players in the world we know have been black, and yet it's almost impossible to see them heading up, seeing big clubs in senior positions, and so on. And I think that's we need to get to the point where we see culture change, which allows people, decision makers, to bring people in and not to see them as a threat.
And in a few weeks, we'll see the latest meeting of the International Football Association Board. It was a regular thing where we see pictures from the meetings where there's either one or no women. It's virtually all white men, very often European dominated. Yet these are the people who are setting the laws of the game, the laws that every player around the world has to follow. Yet it looks very often like it's just white men deciding the laws of the game, which does not reflect at all the game that is played around the world.
I think actually FIFA were hurt by those criticisms that you made, I think, first on Twitter. You spotted the picture, and there was one woman in a picture of about 25 people, and she was a lawyer, I think, for IFAB, right? So I think that will change. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, as my work domain is international, but I live here in the UK. Who are we putting forward? Who is English FA putting forward? Who are the Welsh FA putting forward? The Scots, the Northern Irish? We're as culpable as anybody else in that area, and I think we have to remember that. And really, if we're going to create change, lead some things in that domain.
But equally, it has to be kind of feel normal that there are people of different backgrounds in these rooms. Because Piara, if we go to one of those conferences, like a congress, etc., you look around the room and you raise your eyebrow. Oh, look, there's someone who looks a bit different over there. Until that is kind of normal, the fact that they don't stand out so blatantly, this will be a difficulty even for those who are in, because if you're like one of two people, it's going to be quite hard to change the culture of the place, because you're probably more likely to try and fit in rather than change anything, right? If you're just one of a handful of people, because you don't want to probably stand out more than you already do. It's quite a tough environment for those early individuals who are lucky or unlucky enough sometimes to be brought in.
I think you're right. How many times have we been to places where it's you and me as the brown guys, Bobby Barnes from the PFA as the black guy, in Europe, that is, and then internationally, of course there are Africans and Asians and Latin Americans, but yeah, it's dire, really, and I think that every every profession that makes up the ecosystem that football also needs to look at itself. You guys are representing the media in some ways, and the media has to look at itself and the appointments there. People who are coming through the sponsorship side, they also need to look at themselves. There's a lot to be done, really, and I think my worry is that we spend a lot of time talking about this, much more than people are acting on it. We still haven't got to that point, as we maybe have with the social media issue. We haven't got to that tipping point where people say, I really want to do something. And that is despite the revolution, close to revolution we've seen in the last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, and certainly US corporates making pledges and acting on some of those pledges to change the face of their leadership and their overall kind of corporate makeup.
And the issue is in the media as well. The fact that so often it is a group of white blokes reporting either on a football match in the press box or at a FIFA event as well, asking the questions. And it's something very noticeable, the lack of diversity in the media. I mean, there are groups like Leon Mann's Bicoms that are trying to bring through particularly young black journalists as well, trying to address the issue. But you must see it from the media, even PR, that actually it goes in waves. A newspaper might cover racism for one period of time, or a news outlet, a TV station, but then move on and then return to it sort of when it's in the headlines again, rather than it being a sustained part of the dialogue. And maybe only now it's a continuous thread and it's being talked about and the pressure is being applied to find a way of eradicating the racism.
Yeah, I think sometimes, the focus that we have in the media on racism is interesting. It's important. Sometimes people are going through the motions. They're reporting similar stories from the same angle, and then it's left there for the next news cycle. I think everybody gets fed up even commenting on them, to be honest, because you've seen it 1,000 times before. But I think in general terms, you're right. I mean, I have been surprised here in the UK with the way in which some media outlets, and let's name them, people like Talk Sport, seem to be diversifying. I've seen some interesting stuff happening at BBC Sport, and let's see more of that. The newspapers are still the bastions of a certain type of reporter, I think, but I hope that's changing. You're seeing more and more women there. We all recognise, of course, that change takes time, but there's been a long time talking about this stuff. We really need to see more action. And for people to really understand the dynamics of it, not just to sort of say, isn't racism terrible? We saw another incident last night. That's important to highlight it, to set out a moral position, but that's not enough.
I was interviewing the Aston Villa defender Neil Taylor this week about the PFA's initiative to bring more British Asians into the game, and he's mentoring the future generation. He's very much talking about, at least not necessarily talking about the pitfalls and the negatives the whole time, but trying to sort of encourage how it's a welcoming environment. So obviously that's, the players getting involved from the grassroots level, talking to youngsters, talking to the parents as well.
Yeah, listen, I think people don't believe me when I talk about, the fact that Asians are underrepresented, because they see football talent as, as an area where decisions are not affected by bias. That, if you're talented enough, says the narrative, you will make it through. But it's not that simple. Really, it isn't. I get fed up with all the cliches about doctors and lawyers and all that sort of stuff. I have no doctors in my family. I have no lawyers in my family. The only lawyers I know are human rights lawyers. And so, I'm more likely to know tyre fitters and people who work in banks than I am any of those kind of cliched professions. And actually, for me, it's also been interesting if we look at the medical profession and what we've seen in the pandemic, and the number of Asian doctors you see, the number of Asian scientists, and also the number of Africans involved in the medical profession, and actually that they are so visible, so front of centre, right at the front of the debates, is really interesting. It's really good, because otherwise, I think sometimes, some of us are invisible because we don't have people who are involved in high-profile positions, maybe news reading and parts of the media, but otherwise there's an absence, and I think that's important, and it's important what the PFA are doing. It's important actually that we keep focusing on these issues and looking at the detail of what it takes. I think that's the thing. Sometimes we say we need more black coaches or we need more Asian players, without really looking at what needs to be done and looking at almost in a scientific way, and then putting forward initiatives, some of which we know are going to fail, but others that will succeed. And some people see that as risk-taking, but I personally don't think it is. It brings rewards when you're successful.
Piara, thanks for all your insights and observations. It's been really great to have you at length on this episode of Sport Unlocked.
Thanks, Rob. Great to join you guys. What a great little setup you've got here.
Thanks, Piara. Hopefully speak soon. And thank you again alongside me, Martyn Ziegler and Tariq Panja, as we come to an end of this episode of Sport Unlocked. If you've got any questions, really grateful to get your feedback. We're at Sport Unlocked on social media. We're also on email at sportunlockedpod@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying us, we'll be really grateful if you could rate, review and subscribe to us on whichever platform you're listening to us on. For now, enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead, and hopefully we'll speak soon. Goodbye.